Hello students and parents, hope you're doing well. We're introducing a new content area for our classroom. That's going to be science. And the first question we're going to ask is, what is science? In general, what is science? And we're going to cover this so students have a good idea of how science came about, how it kind of functions in society as far as, any of the disciplines in science that someone might be interested in, how that might be generalized into all sciences, so you get an idea of how basically math and physics and understanding the scientific process have evolved over a period of time, a very short period of time actually, and how our world has kind of used it in ways that you might not even consider. This is not a long video, but it's a short and very concise general idea of science. I hope this answers your question if you ever had that question. What is science? In your packet this week, you notice that there is a science passage. So we're going to ask the question, what is science? So you're going to need your spiral notebook. We're going to take notes, so you're going to follow along with me and just copy what I write down. So make sure you have a pencil, and if your eraser broke, make sure you have an eraser. Anytime that this video that I'm writing too fast or get a little bit ahead of you, we'll go ahead and pause the video and catch up. But I just want you to listen and copy down what I write in my spiral notebook as well. Okay, so the question we're going to be asking, since we're going to be doing more science from now to the end of the year, is, what is science? And there are many sciences that are available as occupations. People get into sciences. Medicine is a science. Nurses use a lot of science. But if we had to define science as one thing, what would that be? The sciences have come about because of testing of evidence. It's the testing of evidence against not our imaginations, but our experiences. Now, our experiences are probably the most easiest thing to start out with within science, and we could say that our experiences are our observations. And I'll get into that a little bit more. The evidence over here is things that are factual. Okay. And testing is in science, and you probably know this already, we use a lot of experimentation. That's a long word. So we take all three of these things and we add them together, and it has to be repeatable. Okay, this is one of the more important parts of science, is that we take our experimentation, our factual, we keep it factual. We use our observations. Sometimes these are used in different ways. Sometimes observations comes first, then experimentation, then we get some facts from there. But it all comes down to being repeatable. If what we do, someone else can do as well and get the same results, that's science. So let's look what's observational. So what's observational around us? What's some of the things that we see around us all the time? Well, we certainly see animals. And we watch animals, they migrate. Okay, birds come in and out of different seasons. They have their habitats, the places they live and how they live. Others, plants. And they're edible plants, the ones we buy in the store and the ones we grow in our gardens. And then there's poisonous plants, the ones we'd like to stay away from and usually don't taste very good. Both these live on the earth. If we look at the earth as, one collective thing, one collective place, on the earth we have water and we have rocks. And if you live in certain places of the earth, there's volcanoes. We don't have any volcanoes here, but they do exist. We know that. We have what's above the earth. We have sky. Okay, in the sky we have obviously the sun. And we have weather, clouds and rain and such. And then at night we have the moon. We have the stars. And we have planets, but we didn't know they were planets. We called them something else, but they behave differently than stars. Let's see if I can squeeze that in there. And then something that, because we're human and we live on the earth, which is the ground and the soil that we live on, there's a whole nother world that exists on the planet. And it's actually, there's more of it than there is land. What am I talking about? Anybody know? The oceans. So in the oceans, that's salt water. That's a saltwater environment. And within these oceans, we have, they don't have a sky, but they have rocks, they have volcanoes, they have plants that are edible and poisonous, they have animals that migrate. It's a whole nother world, these oceans. We don't live by them, we don't live in the oceans, so we don't think a lot about them. But there's almost 2 different planets on our single planet, and that's the life that exists in the ocean and the life that exists on the land. Go ahead and pause the video, make sure that you kind of got this down, because this is really where our science, what is science? This is where our science begins. It begins by everything that we can observe and have been observing for a long time. So let's talk about ourselves for a minute, us as the observers, because we're the ones that came up with science. It wasn't from another animal or magic. We actually came up with the science ourselves. But we did start, and all people started as indigenous people. And indigenous means living independently. And living on the reservation, you know that people live independently and you have your own ways of culture that are different than people that live what we call civilizations. We have that's another long word. And people in civilizations live collectively. Now, indigenous people live collectively also, but in civilizations they live collectively in large places like cities. And they're organized, they're collectively organized. civilizations need to figure out how they're going to get water to themselves, so they don't go down to a stream. They make dams, and they live on top of each other. They have 2 or 3 story, or sometimes in large cities, very many stories of buildings, very tall. They kind of live collectively together, and they organize themselves around living collectively together, where indigenous more live independently in families and such, and they organize, but not to the degree of civilized societies. So we all start out as being indigenous. Every human being started out as being indigenous. And then it took about 10,000 years for us to start forming civilizations. So we've had more experience living indigenously, actually, than we have living as civilizations. And in civilizations, we are used to the modern, what we call modern technology. But that didn't come about it came about very quickly at the end of these 10,000 years, but for the most of our experience, we have been indigenous people. Now, when we lived indigenously, we did have our math. Math was the whole start of science. And for our math as indigenous people, we used it mainly for counting. And then we moved into like operations, where we could start predicting. We could start predicting more of what was happening in the sky. Now remember, science is our observations, and it's repeatable. And in the sky we have the sun and we have the moon. And we kept on noticing that the sun and the moon were keeping repeating themselves. The sun would come up on the east and set in the west. The moon would appear, disappear, reappear. It had its phases. And as we used math to count these, we discovered that we could use operations to predict what's going to happen next in the future. That was a very big step in science, is being able to anticipate the weather changes and to determine when to plant crops, the best time to plant crops. And then, when we became organized into civilizations, our math became a little bit more abstract. So remember, we go from concrete to abstract. So we started out at things that were concrete, and we went to the more abstract. As we formed civilizations, we started to experiment with chemistry. That's how we got all our metals. We started asking questions about motion. Okay, why do things actually move? We asked questions about time. What actually is time and measuring time? A big one, gravity. We started to ask ourselves, what is gravity? We still don't know what gravity is. We started to ask ourselves about light. And in this portion over here, when we started asking all these questions, our math became more complicated. And we got to ask questions about distance and forces. And that gave us a math that we use today called physics. This explains our world around us. We used to explain our world around us up in this area here and use math for counting and operations. And we started asking questions about things collectively, about chemistry and motion and time and gravity and light. And we needed a math for that. And so our math became more and more, went from concrete, which you've heard me say many times before, to abstract. So this is just a really quick and kind of general way of looking at what science is and how we use science in the beginning of looking at and observing our world, to using science that is a little bit, we can't see actually chemistry or motion or time or gravity or light. We can observe it, but we can't explain it. To using math from one of more concrete and something that's in our physical worlds, to things that we can't explain by just observation alone. We have to use experimentation. But all these have the same collective consequences of science. Is we're going to be testing evidence against our experience. We're going to be making observations. We're going to be using experimentation. We're going to come up with some factual things that we notice that are repeatable. And we're going to create and look at science from that standpoint. I hope this helped explain what science is, and I hope you continue to be interested in looking at science and enjoy the passages that you get, not every week, but I'm hoping every other week you'll get a science package that you look forward to.